And
Well,
if folks come in a little bit late, that's fine. We'll catch them up to speed. So thank you all for attending. This is our second webinar. And this is the title of this webinar is Scaling Agile Organically. My name is Brian Green, and I'm a principal with Banner Solutions. Banner Solutions has been involved in Agile coaching, training, and staffing since 2013. We have the ability to provide our services throughout North America and India. Our presenter today is Damon Poole. Damon is part of our consortium of Agile coaches and is currently available to help you with your Agile and scaling efforts. Following the webinar, we will send out an email with a discount offer on coaching services with Damon. For those of you who are not familiar with Damon, he founded AccuRev and has a new startup, Nexel. Nexel is designed to help you keep track of all the things you need to get done in your personal and professional life. Damon was also instrumental in organizing the efforts at Capital One, State Street Bank, and Fidelity, just to name a few. In today's presentation, Damon will discuss his experience scaling organizations organically. And there is, as I mentioned, a chat feature in the webinar to ask questions. We will track and answer them throughout the session as well as at the Q&A in the end. So with that said, I will hand it over to Damon and we will start the webinar officially now.
great. So just word on behalf of Nexel. So if you're interested in being able to organize pretty much anything, events, projects, meetings, what have you, to-dos for yourself, just for yourself or with other people, Nexel provides a free platform for that. And there are business features that businesses can purchase on top of that as well. But for users, it's basically free. All right. So our topic today is scaling Agile organically. And, organically as opposed to what? I guess as opposed to just putting something really large in place and just, going large. One might, I've heard people call it Big Bang. So in order to understand what we mean by Agile and what we mean by scaling, let's just talk about what we mean by Agile first. So when I talk about Agile, I'm talking about the Agile Manifesto. And, sometimes when people talk about Agile, they're really talking about Scrum, or they're really talking about extreme programming or what have you. But Agile really just refers to the principles and values of the Agile Manifesto. So where did it come from? Well, in the 90s, there were actually all these lightweight methodologies out there. Scrum, XP, feature-driven development, etc., existed for quite a while before the meeting in Snowbird in 2001. So the manifesto was actually distilling the principles and values that were represented in the methods of these lightweight methodologies. So let's take a look at Scrum for an example, and we can see a mapping. Now, this is just something that I put together. You can agree or disagree. I'm not saying that this is perfect or anything, but just it gives you an idea of how you can map the individual things in Scrum to the Agile Manifesto. And so part of what we want to do here is if we're going to be scaling Agile, that means that we believe in Agile, we think Agile is important. So we want to make sure to use Agile in anything that we do above and beyond Scrum. So Scrum, for instance, talks about small teams. I believe the recommended team size is sort of no more than 15. Some folks may say less. So if you're going to go beyond a single Scrum team or beyond, say, 15 people, you need to, quote, scale it. And so when we talk about scaling here, we just really mean going beyond 15 people. So it could be 100 people, it could be 800 people, whatever it is in that effort. So that's what we mean by Agile. That's what we're talking about when we talk about scaling. So organically as opposed to Big Bang. So I'm sure that some folks listening to this are thinking, oh, well, wait a minute. There's all these other things out there. There's Scaled Agile, there's Nexus, Enterprise Scrum, less Disciplined Agile. It seems like there are more and more every day. Are you knocking those? No, absolutely not. They're fantastic. There's nothing wrong with those things. I think it's really more of a matter of how does one move from where you are to where you want to be. And so we're going to talk about about that sort of more generically. So to start out with, let's look at where you are today. Let's imagine for a moment that you've got no Agile in there. And, or you could have like a pilot project or something like that. You've just started out, but most of, let's say 50% or more of your organization is doing it the traditional way. So regardless of the teams or the individuals that are doing Agile, whatever flavor it is, whether it's Scaled Agile or Scrum or XP or what have you, you have an existing ecosystem, right? So how you interact with your customers, how leadership and management interact with people, whether they're on a team, or how they ask for reports, the format that they want, the frequency, how meetings are run, how long they are, how many there are, how you develop the software, what are the policies and procedures, is there an audit, is there an approval process, how do you deploy things, how do you do testing, what is portfolio, program, and project management? All of these things are your traditional ecosystem. And all of these different areas you're going to continue to need in some way, shape, or form as you move forward with your Agile ecosystem. The question is, though, what is it going to look like? And I think that's the first time, this is the part where I want to first touch on the idea that moving to Agile is a lot of work, right? So think about how much time it took for your organization to get to where it is with all of these things, how long it took for you and whatever role you're in to become an expert in the kinds of things that you need to do to be successful in your role. Now imagine that the organization is going to switch over to Agile. You've had 2 days of training. What do you think? Well, in my experience, that's a good place to start, but it really is just the start. And I think a good way to look at that is to imagine that you've got a company that's full of pilots that are used to flying small planes, and now you're going to move over to helicopters. And after 2 days of training with a helicopter, let's go, let's fly in formation, woohoo, probably not. The other thing that I want to bring your attention to is in the lower left, it says Agile transformation capability and capacity. So while, for instance, if you want to bring somebody like me in to coach you for, to be embedded and to be there for years, that's great, all in. But I think you want to grow the internal capability, bring in some outside experts, whether it's hiring or consulting, whatever, but you need to build your ability to do this yourself, especially if in the case we're talking about scaling, that you imagine that you're going to have lots of teams and you're going to be bringing on more people, training them. You need the ability to do this internally, to work with people at all different levels, to mentor coaches, product owners, scrum masters, what have you across the organization. So that brings us to one of the first sort of patterns, if you will, to be successful at scaling. One of the things that I see people doing very often is to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Right now, you may be surprised to hear me say this, but as you're going Agile, continue to do the non-Agile things that you do. Right? So think about it this way. You've got a traditional ecosystem, that big blue box represents all of the things on the previous slide, right? All the things that you do, program management, what have you. It took years of experience to get there. You've got people that know what they're doing. There's institutional support, muscle memory. So now, if you just throw these two projects, A1 and A2, Agile projects, out into their own Agile ecosystem, because, quote, Scrum doesn't have that. Scrum doesn't talk about program management, execution leads. It doesn't talk about portfolio managers or anything like that. It just has Scrum Master, product owner, and the development team. So what I see folks doing is they'll have, let's say these two projects are working together towards a common deliverable, and maybe there's an Agile coach in there, and okay, we're going to use Scrum, and there's, quote, supportive managers and some training. But then when there are problems, people say, well, I'm not sure what to do here because Scrum doesn't talk to that. And we've abandoned all of the traditional ecosystem. So what do we do? So for example, in one company I was working with recently, they had 5 Agile Scrum teams that had been running fairly independent of each other, but had a common deliverable. They decided some way into the project, sort of towards the end actually, to put together a scrum of scrums, which is fantastic. And the scrum of scrum meetings went something like this. All right, so we've said that we're going to be done by the end of February, but I just heard that we didn't take into account that one of the teams needs to go through the Apple Store to get approval. So that's 2 weeks. So now we're looking at mid-March. And then another person said, well, I was just talking to the enterprise data team and they're not ready yet. And so we can't test, which is going to add, they said another 2 weeks for them to finish, and then another 2 weeks for us to test, and another 2 weeks to fix any problems. So now we're in mid-April, and that meeting went on like that. So if they had been, whether they were using Scrum or Scrums or not, if they had been using traditional program management in that would have caught that a lot earlier, right? So why abandon the things that you are already good at? Don't do that. And then earlier, I was talking about, so if we're going to grow our ecosystem, let's grow it, right? Instead of a big bang, right? You can put miracle growth, into a plant, I suppose, but it can only grow so fast. And it's the same thing with people in organization. If you try to grow too fast and add too many teams, it's going to fall over, right? You're going to be building a wall out of bricks that are not very solid. So let's grow that system. So imagine you've got a small plant, it's a single team, you have a newly minted Scrum Master, but he's just getting started, and give it some time. And then you see, oh, this team doesn't have enough sunlight, this team doesn't have enough nutrients, whatever it is. Before adding another team, it'd be really good to figure out whether it's related to this initial team or not. It'd be really good to figure out what problems is this team running into in your organization. Right? You can think of it a little bit as a canary in the coal mine. Let's solve those problems, learn from that. Maybe we learned that a domain expert does not actually make a great product owner, because that domain expert was good, but they weren't fantastic at managing expectations of multiple stakeholders. And they weren't really interested in being in that role. So we need to find a new product owner. And it turns out we need to do a little bit more work if we're going to grow more teams, now that we understand what's really needed for a product owner. So you want to grow things. So if we're going to grow the Agile ecosystem and we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, think about growing your Agile ecosystem within the existing traditional ecosystem as its support system. So as that grows, you'll get more people in the Agile ecosystem that perhaps before were program managers, but are now, value stream leads, or for instance, say if it would be a release train engineer or something like that. It doesn't really matter what it's called. It's just that people are moving from the traditional ecosystem into the Agile ecosystem. So as it grows, we can still take advantage of what's there traditionally, but we can also start to take more advantage of what's in our Agile ecosystem. And this links back, right? So one of the reasons that I brought up the Agile Manifesto in the beginning is that if we want to scale Agile, that means that we want to make sure that we're Agile as we go forward in the things that are outside of something like Scrum that is already well known to be Agile. So this is an example of give them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done. And the individuals and interactions are more important. Process and tools are important for sure. Like, let's get Jira in there, let's get Agile Craft in there, let's get Rally or version 1 in there, or what have you. But let's make sure that we're making sure that individuals and interactions are the most important thing. So we want to talk to people on the team, see how it's going, and adjust. So I've got a couple of slides here that just list guidelines, and you'll be able to get a recorded copy of the webinar. So this is just for reference, really. We're going to go into these in more detail. One that we're not going to talk a lot about is limiting projects in progress. So I'm going to talk about that here. So if you're trying to quote scale, right? So you've got maybe one Agile team and you want to move to, just to make it easy numbers, 12, and you've got a year and you've got 12 projects, then one way to do that would actually be have individual teams. But if you've got a limited number of teams and you've got 12 projects going on, then having all of those projects start out at the beginning of the year and run simultaneously, that's what we call multitasking. And it seems like a good idea to do, but really what Agile is saying is let's reduce the complexity of all the coordination of all the people working on different projects and just work on as few projects as we can, get them done, then move on to the next one. Right? So I'm not saying if you have 12 projects you need to get done by the end of the year that you should do fewer projects. I'm saying instead of doing starting all 12 in month one, maybe start one, get it done, then do the next one, then do the next one. And that will actually reduce the complexity, which is an overarching theme here. Reduce the complexity. Okay, so as an example, reducing the complexity and an example of accommodation, let's talk about dependencies. So in some of the frameworks, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, just pointing it out, they talk about managing dependencies. And there's nothing wrong with managing dependencies. But to some degree, it's a coping mechanism. It's an accommodation for the problem that's there. So I would encourage you, regardless of what you do, whether you grow organically or you're going to use one of the off-the-shelf frameworks, think about removing the very problems, the very complexities that you need to deal with as you have large-scale Agile adoption. So here we have two teams that are working together towards a common deliverable, and there's a dependency of something that they've scheduled for the third iteration in one team on something they've scheduled in the first iteration for the other team. Now, one of the things I see all the time is that especially in larger organizations, as they're getting started, they have user stories, but sometimes it's a whole iteration for one user story for the whole team. I gotta tell you, that's technically a user story if you actually get it done by the end of the iteration. But just a rule of thumb, a really good rule of thumb is that for every developer on the team, you want to see something like 2 stories completed all the way to done every week. So if you had a team that had 4 developers on it and you're doing 2 week sprints, or I use the term sprint and iteration interchangeably, by the way, and you had a 2 week sprint, then that would be, let's see, what would that be? 4 times 4 times 2, that'd be 32 user stories over the course of the sprint. Now, you might think that's a lot, but in my experience, that's the thing that you would see out of a healthy Agile team. Lots of small stories. So how is that important here with a dependency? Well, if it's a giant story that's dependent on another giant story, then that means that when I finish the work in the first iteration of the second team, I've got something that's not connected to this other thing, which means it's not actually releasable. Sure, I can turn it off, whatever, but technically it's not releasable. That can cause coordination problems. What if it turns out that the other team doesn't get their thing done until a future iteration? They're running into problems. Well, then what was the point of doing the work in the B team here? And that can cause delays. It's difficult to synchronize. It's hard. If you're working within one team, you don't have these problems. But as you have more and more teams, these kinds of problems are going to show up more and more. So what can you do? So think of it as, okay, I've got these 2 large stories that they depend on each other. If they're that large, it's very, very likely you can break it down into stories. Now, that's a whole different topic. There's a whole bunch written out there on splitting user stories. And if you're shaking your head and saying it's too hard, we tried that. Believe me, it can be done. It's a skill set. It's definitely learnable. I've seen every organization I've ever worked with has succeeded at this. So we split the stories. So let's say that it splits down into 6 stories for each larger story here. And what that means is it's likely that it's a much smaller piece that depends on another much smaller piece. So now that we've got 2 small stories, we've broken out where the dependence is. All the other stories, at least in this example, are independent. Now we can reschedule that and say, hey, we can work on these 2 stories that depend on each other within the same iteration across the 2 teams. We resolve any problems now, right? So there's not the problem of later, gee, was that really me that worked on that? Well, it says so here on the version control system, right? So we're working hand in hand between the 2 teams to get that done. So that also goes along with the principle from the manifesto that working software is the primary measure of progress. If we believe in that, then we really want to make sure that at the end of every iteration across all the teams working together, it really is releasable. This is just an example of reducing the complexity. So some more techniques, and this is not a list of do these things. It's not a prescription. And if you look at Discipline Agile, Enterprise Scrum, and SAFe, and all the others, you're going to see a lot of overlap between them because really there's no magic here. I've gotten together with large groups of coaches in the past and facilitated sessions where we looked for, hey, if it was up to you, what are the kinds of things that you would do? And it's really the same list of about 20 things that people use when they're scaling. And maybe there's 15 that I particularly like, 15 that you particularly like, but they're going to combine together into somewhere around the same 20 pretty much all the time. So here are some examples. So daily team coordination called Scrum of Scrums, multi-team retrospectives. And we're going to go through each of these in a moment. There's two on here we're not going to talk about, which is refactoring and automation. That's a lot like getting to small user stories. By having developers that are good at refactoring and by having automation in place, you're going to be able to work much quicker, much more smoothly. There's going to be a lot less coordination, and those are things that you want to have in place. Now, refactoring, if you want to figure out if your developers really understand refactoring or have more to learn, ask them if they're familiar with the open-close principle and other things from object-oriented programming. If not, then now is definitely the time to bring somebody in that is familiar with Agile coding. Okay, so let's take a look here at some of the things that we can do. And again, I'm not saying do all of these things. I'm saying take a look at where you are and consider what problem you're trying to solve. So here we have 3 teams that are going to start working together. Maybe they're working on something different or, whatever. But so we start out, and a really simple thing to do is just to coordinate them with a daily Scrum of Scrums. Now, again, you want to adapt here. So whether it's daily or weekly, maybe in the beginning, just do it weekly and figure out, oh, weekly is not enough. Let's do it twice a week. Let's do it daily. Figure out what works in the specific circumstances that you're in. Right? It's an idea, it's something to try. Then further from that, you can probably see that these teams are not aligned, their cadences are not aligned. So a very common thing to do is align the cadences so the start and stop are the same. Right? So here we've got a 1-week Scrum team, a 2-week Scrum team, and a Kanban team. Now they're aligned every week. Every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, they have something that's deliverable in theory across all 3 teams. When you have that common cadence, you can now try things like, hey, we had our retrospective. How did your retrospective go? Oh, we ran into that too. So since you have that common interest of a common deliverable, why not considering doing your review together? So it may be that some people call this the demo. You do the demo for your own team, then you do a demo that it actually works across all the work for all 3 teams. And you might find out like, okay, our new controls look good and work, but apparently we didn't get the memo that the colors changed. So we got, one theme over here and one part of the product and a different theme over there. Good to know. So the other thing you can do is, how did that problem come up? So let's have our individual retrospectives, but then let's send them to representatives, or maybe you can do an open space if folks are together and do an all-team retrospective and figure out what's affecting all of us that we could fix, work on together, and make everything smoother. A couple of other things, different frameworks call these different things, so I'm just going to genericize it to, if you have multiple teams working together, they're working towards a common value stream, as we call it. So having a value stream manager for the product, somebody that it may be a product owner on one of the teams, or it may be, quote, chief product owner, doesn't really matter what you call it, but somebody that's going to act as the value stream manager for the product, making sure that product decisions are synchronized across the various teams, that the stakeholders involved are all on the same page across all the different teams. Somebody that's making sure that this is running smoothly across the teams, not just within the teams. And the same thing for project or program or portfolio management, however you look at that within your organization. So, you could think of a traditional program manager. That's great. It's the same skill set primarily here. And just having somebody that makes sure that the trains are running according to schedule together and coordinated, that's something that's important. Now, again, I'm not saying must do all these things. I'm saying, maybe these teams they work well together. There's not a lot of coordination issues, so that you don't need a value stream program manager, but that you just, the daily scrum of scrums is enough. So it's up to you. You figure it out. Lastly, what a lot of folks have found useful is to have, if you're working in an agile manner, then you want to find and fix problems as fast as you possibly can. So you go to the stand-up, find a problem, can't resolve it within the team. You go to the daily stand-up of stand-ups, can't resolve it there. Bring it, escalate it. So having somebody that walks in at the end of your daily scrum of scrums that says, hey, is there anything I can do for you? It doesn't have to be the same executive or leader all the time, but just somebody that has the power to make things, fix things quickly. Have them walk in. It's great for them too, because they don't have to go to a whole bunch of meetings. It's all summarized for them. No problems today. No problems today. Big problem today. Big problem today. No problems today. So another thing that helps with scaling that people don't always look at is, what about the demand flowing in, right? So, hey, we've already got this multi-year roadmap. It's all planned out, and the teams are aligned, and we've got this all set. But how agile can you really be if you have a whole bunch of work planned ahead of time that's set in concrete and must be done, that was agreed to months and months ago, and the sprints are all laid out? Well, I'm going to tell you, some, but not as much as it could be. So the other thing when you're trying to scale and make multiple teams work together, work really well, coordinated, synchronized, fluid and frictionless, is to make sure that the work you're talking about is broken up into small chunks. Now, Scrum says, and I'm sort of focusing on Scrum, but you can genericize this to other frameworks, that you want to have something releasable on a regular basis and truly releasable, right? So sometimes people say, well, we can only put the infrastructure together in the first couple of iterations, and we've got a testing iteration, and hey, that's great. That's not actually Scrum though. Scrum means you're going start to finish on things, including UX and testing and everything within your iterations. And so that's a goal. It's not easy to get to, but that's the goal. And that's where you start to get the benefits, is when, as an organization, within any individual team or across multiple teams working together, they're coordinated and releasable across all teams, every iteration. It doesn't mean, so it's releasable. It doesn't mean you're going to release every iteration. It may be that you have something that, it basically works, but it's not as fancy as it's going to be. It doesn't have the full feature set, but it makes one persona happy, and then we're going to add the next persona. So that means that you can get it out there to folks that are in the first persona and say, hey, what do you think? Does this have everything that you need, while you go and work on the other persona? So breaking it up. So here we have the orange project, the yellow project, the red project, what have you. And so having the organization have the capability to do funding and priority, changing priority on a iteration by iteration basis, that's fantastic. Quarter by quarter, not so bad. Yearly, really not that agile. So the shorter time frame for making these decisions also helps you to scale, because it's going to make things more fluid. Right. So here, let's take a look at an example. So the first iteration across these teams, we decide this is what we're going to do. We're not going to start the red project yet, or the purple project. We're going to make progress on the orange and the yellow and the green and the gray. Then we get the folks together and say, hey, where do you want to make progress next? So let's keep going with some of these, but the yellow project, we get a bunch of work done there. It's a tricky persona. We want some feedback. So those two teams have the ability to work on some different things. They have the skills, they have the knowledge, the domain knowledge, whatever. So we're going to retask them to something else, and then again and again. So it also means that you can make progress on multiple projects across multiple stakeholders instead of telling them, just wait, your time is coming, or, hey, we're going to start everything. It's the, hey, we're going to start everything that really adds to the complexity, the confusion, and the difficulty in scaling. So we're sort of getting to the conclusion here, some of the last couple of slides, and then we'll have a Q&A and some discussion. But the basic idea here, if we go all the way back to what we were first talking about, is you want to start small and grow. So imagine here as an example, we have an organization that hasn't done anything yet. They have this one team, they're getting going, and hey, that's fantastic. So now they want to grow. So they want to move to 2 teams, whether these are teams working on the same thing or not, that's not important right here, but in general. But let's say for this example, they are working together. So they're working a little bit and they're like, whoa, we had sort of a ad hoc meeting of the Scrum Masters and product owners, and that solved some problems. I think we should, formalize that. Let's have a weekly co-planning meeting. So we're having planning every 2 weeks, but every week, let's also get together and just say, hey, what's coming up? Let's coordinate, look and see if there's dependencies. And then let's also, the iteration review, some people call it a demo, didn't go too well, right? There were a lot of problems where, team A was working well and team B's stuff didn't demo well, and vice versa, actually. So let's do the individual reviews, but let's not rely on that. Let's do a demo of the whole product across multiple teams. That'll also show us whether or not the stuff is actually working. And let's coordinate our cadence, right? So we thought that if we were only 1 day off, that would be fine, but it turns out that we were doing our retrospective before knowing what was going on with the other team, before seeing that the product didn't work well when it was integrated together. So let's coordinate our cadences and start and stop on the same day. Or another example of that would be you have a team that has a 3-week iteration. One team has a 3-week iteration, the other has a 2. The only time you're going to coordinate those 2 teams is actually every 6 weeks. That's how that math works out. So having a 3-week iteration is fine as long as everybody is compatible with that. So either Kanban or 3-week iterations or 1-week iterations. If you have 2-week iterations in there with a 3-week iteration, it's just not going to work. So see if the 2-week iteration teams are willing to move to 1 week, or probably better, let's see if we can get the 3-week team to move to 2 or 1 week. Okay, so next step, we're growing larger and larger, and let's take a look at what happens when we go the next step. So now it's getting more complicated, so we decided to add a value stream product manager. We're going to move to that daily stand-up of stand-ups thing, and we want to have a retro of retros. Right? So I'm talking here about pretty simple practices and adding them as we go, as opposed to these folks having to learn all kinds of new things all at once, right? I mean, people can only absorb things so fast. Now, again, those of you that are familiar with SAFe or LESS or whatever might be thinking, hey, are you saying don't do those? Again, I'm not saying that. I'm saying let's start small and grow. So it may be that a few folks here have you have them go through leading SAFe or something like that so they can see where we're going. But getting folks trained in doing Scrum well, working in small teams well, is a fantastic lead-in to having their minds open and ready to hear more about things like SAFe and what have you. So it's a good way to ease into it. And again, this goes back to the Agile Manifesto. So if we're talking about growing, we're also talking about what do these teams need? That's really architecting and design, and whether it's code or it's your agile implementation, it's the same thing, right? So the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. So having the people involved in this growth actually have a say in what are we going to do and how are we going to add it. That's having them be part of that, be the self-organizing team. So along with this, my hope is that you have a group of people that are working on this, setting up the training, making sure that there are folks that can talk to team members to answer questions, that you have like an Agile office with office hours or a wiki with materials, how we are doing Agile here today, all that kind of support that goes around these teams and helps you to build your Agile ecosystem. So we talked about, an example of how we're growing from one team to the next, and a little bit on the capabilities and capacity of your organization to grow and expand. Let's look in more detail. So you have one team. Frankly, in my experience, sending the Scrum Master to CSM training, there's nothing wrong with CSM training, but it's a little bit misleading. Certified Scrum Master does not make you a Scrum Master. It's like going to the preview of a movie about climbing Everest does not make you ready to climb Mount Everest. It helps you understand what climbing Mount Everest involves, but it's really just a preview. Even going to watch the movie about climbing Everest does not make you an expert. It gives you maybe more of a sense for the danger and some of the things you need to bring with you, but it's still not the same. So having an experienced Scrum Master and experienced product owner is a lot like having a Sherpa when you're climbing, whether it's Mount Everest or the Blue Hills or K2 or whatever. Making sure that not just the Scrum Master, but everyone on the team is formally trained is very important. So imagine, if you will, you have a bunch of folks that have never done Scrum or Agile before. The Scrum Master goes off and comes back and is talking about, we did this exercise where we threw a ball to each other, and it really helped me understand how important it is for everybody to, you'd be looking at the other team members and they'd be like, what exactly did you learn there? So having this one person come back and represent what Scrum is and Agile and all that, it's not that great, right? So if this team is going to be working together, it's good to train them together. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. Not only that, but making sure that the ecosystem around them understands what's going on. So as a minimum, making sure that for the people that are on that team, whoever they report to has also gone through that training is good. And lastly, that there's air cover. Now, a lot of times when I go to organizations, I hear things like, absolutely, everybody's on board with this. There's support at the executive level, and that's fantastic. But again, in my experience, it's, people will say that they support, but they don't necessarily know what they're supporting. That sometimes, especially with executives that aren't necessarily as close to this or haven't been through one of these before, they're thinking that, so the developers, for instance, rather than working in Java, now they're going to be working in Scala. As long as the code gets together, it doesn't really impact me. But that's not true. In fact, there's going to be impacts all over the organization. How reporting is done, status reporting is done is different. Who reports to who can be different. The idea of having dedicated teams as opposed to people allocated 20%, 30%, 50%, all these numbers less than 80 to 100%. There's going to be all kinds of problems. So you want to make sure that there's some air cover there and that folks have an idea of the kinds of problems that they're going to run into and the kinds of problems that they're going to need to help solve if Agile is going to be successful here. So this one team, again, as I said earlier, you can think of it as a canary in the coal mine. It's going to help you understand where the problems are in your organization that you need to solve. Probably not all of them, but what are the top ones you need to solve before you move on to multiple teams? So what you really need to succeed here is you need somebody who is a senior Scrum Master or a seasoned Agile coach to work with you to help understand, with coordinating across these three teams, what needs to be done. Now, this is assuming that those 3 teams are coordinated. If there are 3 individual teams working on individual projects and they're not related, then you're still back sort of in the first column. But you are going to run into more problems, even if they're not coordinated, as more people are impacted by this, Agile thing. It's also good to have somebody who's an experienced Agile product manager. So that's somebody more on the business side, on a plane, dealing with customers more, on the road, however you want to look at that, that understands product management from an Agile perspective, how to break things down into smaller chunks, like we were talking about earlier, and managing an overall portfolio and limiting work in progress, that kind of thing at the portfolio level. The other thing that I really hope that you have in place at this point is a cross-functional Agile adoption team with representatives from different parts of the company, and that they are running as an Agile team, right? So you want to think of Agile as a project in your overall portfolio. What would you do with a project in your portfolio? You'd have a funding request, you'd justify it, you'd say, who's going to be working on this? What's the time frame? What are the expected results? You'd want reporting out on that, and all the kinds of things that you would do for a project in your portfolio. You want to do that same thing with your Agile adoption. And sort of lastly here in the large category, this shows 10 teams, but I've worked in organizations that have had dozens and even hundreds of teams. Regardless of the scale, now at this point, you want to make sure that you have an appropriately staffed Scrum Master, product owner, manager, coach, mentorship and training program. So what this means is that you have a network of people that are experienced as Scrum Masters, product owners, what have you, that can work with new folks that are coming on board to help them understand what it really means to be a good Scrum Master, a good product owner. There was one organization I ran into that they had set up the exact same processes and practices across dozens of teams, and sadly, they were all wrong, right? So what they had learned as an institution was that if you have a large project of 80 people, that for every 10 people you pick a representative, and those individual teams were working on all kinds of different stuff, but they weren't working in an Agile manner. So the 10 people at the stand-up meeting were actually representatives of a group of other people that weren't there, right? So when I walked in, it looked like Scrum, but it was not Scrum. And they had even instituted using blue painter tape to make swim lanes across their card walls. And so every day I would walk into another team, and there was the blue painter tape. They had institutionalized, bad practices rather than getting it working well with a couple of teams and then scaling from there. So please don't do that. The other kinds of things that you need are you want somebody who's a senior tech lead who really understands things like the open-close principle, the single responsibility principle, all those kinds of things that come with Agile coding. Same on the test side, same with the UX side. And of course, while you may say, oh, DevOps, that's the new trend. DevOps really, not to go into that in detail, but that's really, just like in the past, it seemed like, kind of crazy to have a QA person dedicated to the team. This is saying, let's have the ops skills and or an ops person right in the team, that there isn't a separate dev organization and ops organization. We're going to merge those two together and make sure that we have common tooling, all that kind of stuff. So having somebody like that in the building is very important. And, again, this speaks to, let's not just do 2 days of training. That's not giving people the environment and support they need. Let's really give them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done. Lastly, before we go into Q&A, so you've got your first team and you want to add more. So ask yourself the question, is our current Agile ecosystem stable? You might want to bring in an outside expert to give their opinion and say, wow, you've got a really good team here. You definitely have the capacity to start another team and have it work out well. However you're going to do it. It's good to have in your mind as you start out, what does success look like? So let's say you know that. And if the answer is yes, great, let's add more people to the Agile ecosystem. If the answer is no, then solve those problems. You know, I'm not saying you have to be perfect, but define what is good enough. Solve those problems with this first team, get to good enough before you add another team. Because if you start propagating out to more teams with whatever the bad habits are that the institution has, you're just going to propagate that. And you're going to get more, you know, agile, but not necessarily good agile. So, you know, please don't do that. Actually, go ahead and do that. It works out well for me. But you know, honestly, frankly, I don't really. I would much rather go in and help people get better rather than, take care of a huge problem. So please don't grow too fast. That's my advice there. And then rinse and repeat. So this links back to the manifesto about at regular intervals, the team, and in this case, the team is the wider team, reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. If you're not doing something like this as you grow, then you're not really being agile at scale. Right? You may be agile at the Scrum team level, but not institutionally. So just quickly, we'll send the full thing on this in an email, as Brian mentioned earlier, but we do have this special offer. Normally, we can do up to 2 days. There's a lot of material here, and that's $2,500 a day. But we're offering for a limited time, one per organization, a 1-day workshop version of this for $750 for the whole day. It's an intensive full-day team-based coaching experience. It's really fantastic. Get the team together in one place, and it can be used for a new team, and it can be used as a checkup or introducing advanced techniques to the mature team. And it's using their own work. So it's not, offline, if you will. They're going to be working on their real work and making progress. But it's very intensive. And I've seen this work wonders, really have breakthroughs. And some of the topics there are product visioning, epic creation, user story writing, and splitting, backlog grooming. So for a new team, this is getting set for the first iteration. For an existing team, this is kind of a checkup, finding problems and fixing them that are specific to that team. And so we'll send more details. All right, so Q&A. How are we looking, Brian?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. One of them came from James in the chat, and I wanted to get to that. So he asked, so this process only works when it's combined with some type of planning. Is there a planning process that you've seen that works better than others, or does it depend on the organization?
So, okay. So let's parse that. So Agile, right? So planning is definitely important. I think the only difference between planning and traditional and Agile is that Agile says, the initial plan is interesting, but let's adjust and adapt as we go. And so I'm not sure, and feel free to follow up on this, if the planning you're talking about here is the expansion of Agile or the planning at the of the actual work that we're talking about. That I'm going to guess it's the actual work. So whether you're doing scaled Agile or just plain Scrum, let's look at Scrum for a minute. Within Scrum, the planning and the iteration or sprint planning is specifically what is the work we're going to do, for instance, for this 2 weeks, if you have a 2-week iteration, and how are we going to get it done? And that's it. We're not looking forward past that iteration. And so that can be pretty quick. And that's just, who's going to do it? What are we going to do? Do we feel like we have the right amount? So that's pretty straightforward. If you've got multiple teams, then they're each going to do that. And then depending on the organization, that may be something that you want to do before iteration planning or coordinate after, or, as I was suggesting, have a weekly coordination meeting that involves planning every week. So that would be sort of coordination planning, and that's more sort of adjusting, right? So based on what each individual team wants to do, needs to do, what changes might make sense. And then lastly, sort of the quote, dreaded upfront planning. Well, Scrum only talks about what are you going to do this iteration. It doesn't talk to what's your overall plan. So in the Agile world, we would say it's fantastic to have an overall plan, but let's make sure that we've done just the minimum required to get there, and that we understand that this may change, and so we're ordering it in terms of value, and it's not a set in concrete kind of thing. So one of the things that I find works really well is that you do some product visioning, break that down into epics, and these things are very quickly described. Do some story mapping, which really I think is more product mapping, but whatever, story mapping. And very quickly we can get together a sketch of a plan, and then we can decide how much more detail we want. And if, as an organization, right, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, you need full, PRD, MRD, whatever RD that you need. Having done some of these agile techniques first, you're likely to have a better overall plan. So yes, it does depend on the organization. That's part of the idea, the overall idea that we're talking about today. But I'm certainly not somebody that says no planning. I say just the right amount of planning. Hopefully that answers the question, but feel free to follow up. Okay, what else have we got, Brian?
Sure. So another question we have is, why not just get SAFe training? It seems to me that they have everything that you mentioned.
that's a good question. I'm guessing maybe that was a little tongue in cheek, but that's fine. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with 2 days of SAFe training, or actually I think it's more like 5 days. There's different offerings, like there's the leading SAFe, and then there's the full enchilada, if you will. That's fantastic. I think my only point there would be, if you're thinking about having 100 people that have never done Scrum or Kanban or anything Agile, go to 5 days of training. And sure, I understand that there might be a workshop in there for 2 days using your own real work, and that's great. To me, what I've seen is that really is a lot like taking 100 people that are used to flying helicopters and saying, "Hey, you're now a Cessna pilot. Let's fly in formation." That seems scary to me, and I've never really seen that work real well. Now, it depends on what you mean by work, and what I mean by work is that those folks are able to work unassisted, no consultants, and produce something relatively close to what the customer wanted, relatively close to your original plan. So what I really see happening is you do the training, and then you realize it wasn't enough, so you bring in some outside consultants, which of course is fine with me. But I'd really like we do these webinars partly because we want to help people succeed. And so yes, let's do that training, but let's understand that we should start small. So let's get folks working with just plain old Scrum first, and let's send a few people to the full-on SAFe training so that they understand what's coming next and can help the organization navigate those waters, get some success in the small first within your existing traditional framework, then scale out, right? So then maybe, okay, you've got success with 3 teams working together. Now let's go send them to SAFe training and say, okay, you've had the training. That's what we could do. Out of all those things, what should we do next, right? So adopting the pieces that make sense, moving from your traditional ecosystem to more and more of an agile ecosystem. So in the end, you may end up with 100 people doing all of SAFe. I can't say that I've ever seen an organization that does all of SAFe, but I think it's better to start out from where you are and grow into what you need. And again, hopefully that answered the question, but feel free to follow up.
All right, another question we have is, with regards to scaling organically, wouldn't it take longer to convert to Agile this way?
Yes. What's the next question? Yes, it certainly would. I think the part of this is, I've been doing this for a while. I won't go into how long, but a while. And things can only grow so fast. They can only grow so fast. So the idea is, let's figure out for this organization in these circumstances, let's help them grow as fast as they possibly can in their Agile capabilities, their Agile adoption. but let's try not to go faster, because what happens is when organizations try to go faster and they overreach, um, I know one company, not that I was working at, but went to do a lunch and learn there, and I heard a horror story where they had an agile team, and they released something that wasn't ready. They didn't have enough test automation in place or something. I don't know what it was, but unfortunately, it affected all of their users. It was millions of users for some, unacceptable point in time. And so, from what I'd heard about what happened there was that as an organization, they had sort of overreached, and the damage caused by that release that really wasn't ready, that folks hadn't gotten used to the new rhythms, was it meant that people were really not, they were disinclined for doing more agile, and so it took a while for that organization to recover and move forward. So fast is great, but let's try to go as fast as we can and no faster.
Got it. Another question. So which of the frameworks do you think is best? And I get that we should adopt whatever we choose organically.
So a while back, I was doing some agile training, and the person that brought me in paired me up with a communications expert, and that was really interesting because that leader's perspective was that part of the problem they were running into was bad communication, and that guy had this great example of working with kids, coaching them on football. Now, anybody that knows me knows I'm not a football expert, so please bear with me. And so, the coach asked the kids, "Hey, what is the best throw, possible, throwing a football?" And one kid said, "Oh, it should be, fast and low." And the other one said, "No, you got to sort of lob it." And another said, "You got to make sure the spin is really good." And so the coach said, "Those are all good, but really what I was looking for is the best throw is the one that gets caught." And so, if you think of your organization as people looking to get good at working in an agile way, the best framework for your organization is the one that gets adopted. And so you can definitely, if you look online, there are comparisons and discussions. And I would encourage you to talk to your peers and say, "Hey, what experience did you have with this?" Send a couple of different people to some of the different trainings and get a sense of what's involved, and think about how well would it work within your organization. And then, the other thing here is, if you're growing organically, growing your agile adoption organically, the folks that are working on that are going to get a sense of the kinds of problems that you need to address, and have more background and experience in the kinds of questions to ask, the kinds of things to look at in these different frameworks. So I guess you're probably getting from me that the answer is that there's no such thing as a best one, but there are a number of them that will work well, and your organization is going to, it's going to depend on your organization. The other thing I would say is that things like Scrum have been around for a long time, and out of all those different methodologies like Crystal methodology and whatever, Scrum and the XP practices like continuous integration and refactoring have sort of, quote, won, if you will. And I would say that in the scaling space, you could argue that SAFe is sort of the clear winner, but less has really been gaining steam lately, and so I think it's still a lively race, and there's no clear winner, if you will. So look around, see what makes sense for your organization.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Certainly, we can answer any other questions through email or through the website. So we will be sure to follow up with a link to this to everybody that attended, as well as it will be posted to bannersolve.com, and we will post it to our YouTube channel as well. So thank you very much, Damon, and thanks to all the participants for attending today.
My pleasure, and great questions. I really enjoyed everybody's participation. Until next time.
Thank you.